Welcome to the Canadian Food Podcast, where we explore the foods that made us and all the drama that comes with them. My name is Victoria Gronde, and I am a food writer, chef, and someone who romanticizes being anxious and overworked.
And I'm Juan Palma. I love to cook, but mainly eat. I love bonding with people through food, which means I'll eat just about anything in the name of experiencing something new. I haven't had food poisoning just yet, but experts say it's just a matter of time. Today, we'll be covering butter tarts and trying out three different types.
Absolutely. We're going to look into the somehow disputed, somehow confusing history of the butter tart, how to make the perfect one at home, and then we'll quickly look into the world of butter tart tourism in Canada before designing our very own butter tart and butter tart themed dessert.
Yes, and along the way, we will be trying out the classic butter tart, the raisin butter tart, and finally the salted pecan butter tart.
Yes, so this episode will be flaky, buttery, and as always, just a little bit salty. Let's get into it, starting off with the definition of what a butter tart is.
According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, a butter tart is a small pastry tart which generally consists of butter, sugar, syrup, and egg, filled into a flaky pastry and baked until the filling is semi solid with a crunchy top.
Yes, and I like to think that butter tart is almost, if not completely identical to the French Canadian sugar pie, but there are some distinctions to be made.
Right, so sugar pies are huge and use both maple sugar and cream, whereas butter tarts, on the other hand, use brown sugar, corn syrup, and butter.
Even then, those distinctions are quite minute because you could very well use maple syrup in both and no one would say anything. So those are very small differences.
Right.
Now, the first published English butter tart recipe was reported in 1900 with the Women's Auxiliary of the Royal Victoria Hospital cookbook. But that doesn't tell the whole history of the dish. It's actually believed to come from the filles du roi or king's daughters. Now, I've explained a little bit of their history to you. So, who do you think they were?
Who do I think the filles du roi were?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, you kind of threw me off for the whole, hospital cookbook that you threw in there. I was going to say nurses, and then you kind of kept going, and I was like, they were
Okay.
babysitters. I beats me.
Yeah, so the king sent us a bunch of babysitters to work with.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, honestly, with the way we were behaving, that's what we would needed. So essentially, it's 1663. At the time that the colonies in New France were in the middle of being founded, King Louis XIV was in a little bit of a pickle. So he had just taken control back over the colonies. And he realized that the goons who were there before him had spent all their time exploiting natural resources and none of the time just populating the region. So there were virtually no women in the Nouvelle France, and the population was really, really small. So
Hmm.
what he did is between 1663 and 1673, he brought roughly 800 single women from France to the colonies of New France with the goal of having them marry and form families. Now, the women agreed in exchange for a free trip to the Nouvelle France, new clothes, and sometimes a dowry.
Great trade.
Excellent trade. But you have to understand that if Canada's a cold and uncomfortable place now, it was even more the case in the 1600s. It was cold, muddy, slimy, and sticky. So
Great
why did
combination.
ugh, disgusting. So why did those women come? Well, this was their one chance to better their conditions. So, although a handful of them came from higher classes, it was a really, really small proportion. So, most of them came from orphanages across France. So, teachers and historians like to tell us about the king's daughter in a very, very black and white way. So, I learned about them in school and we talked about them every year. When I was younger, they would like to say that they were the most beautiful Cinderellas who got dolled up and crossed the sea to find their one true love.
I
Then,
believe it.
as you got older, Others like to say that they were poor, sad little orphans who were exploited, forced to marry, and then turned into baby factories. I think the truth of it lies in the middle. Yes, a large majority of them were orphans, but to bear the title of the king's daughters, they had to be picked amongst thousands of candidates. So, a good example of that is at some point throughout the program, women needed a certificate of good conduct in order to be accepted and sent to new friends. That was a way to prove that they had good manners and strong morals.
Hmm.
So ultimately, they were just really strong, smart women who decided to risk what little they had in order to build better lives for themselves. And ultimately, this would pay off. So if you had to pick between fending for yourself in France or gambling it away in the Nouvelle France, what would you do?
Well, I don't actually gamble in real life, but if this was me, I would gamble in real life. I'm a risk taker, even though I don't like to gamble, but I would definitely gamble it away in Nouvelle France because that sounds kind of exciting. Let's just throw it out there, you know?
I'm gonna be honest. I would stay put. I don't like
Really? Oh my god.
no, but like the idea of like going from France, where yeah,
Hmm.
things are bad, but like they're established, they have buildings. I guess I like cities. I like when things are certain. I like that even though I don't have resources or money to buy resources, I know they're there and someone picked them for me.
Mm.
So I would rather be in the place that has bread I can't buy than the place that has no bread and I can buy everything. Like, you know what I mean?
I completely understand. I think for me, it's just a matter of excitement. I'm sometimes I get so bored. Sometimes I'm just living life, and I'm sitting here and I start breathing, and I'm like, this is so boring. I wish I could have some crazy risk. Give me COVID. Let me have some fun in life.
You just want a little spice, a little excitement, a
Yes,
little oomph.
exactly. Yes.
I mean, I think that's something you have to address in therapy, but that's okay. I feel like for me, it's the question of like, would you go on Survivor? And my answer is no, because I wouldn't do something I know I would immediately lose at.
Sure.
So that's the thing. I think you would probably have a shot at winning at Survivor. I feel like I would talk to producers out of taking me home and deleting the footage. So I feel like I would go full Les Miserables and just end up bald and hungry in new friends, in old friends. You know,
Hmm.
I
I'll be
think
completely honest.
yeah,
I think the shot that I would have in Survivor would only get me into like episode 2, and that's it. That's about as far as I would go. And then after that,
yeah.
I won't be able to do it.
I don't think you would make it very
Win it?
far.
No, no,
No, no,
not
no.
even
But I
close.
think you would be excited to be there.
Oh yeah,
You would be
definitely.
the guy that's like, oh, I love
I'm just
challenging
happy to be
myself,
here.
and on episode 3, you're naked and sad. You know?
Yes, yes, exactly. It's like, sir, didn't you sign up for this? I just wanted to like try it, man.
Yeah,
I wasn't
I
here to
didn't
win.
know. I didn't know y'all didn't give me food. You know? They said on Reddit that you did.
Yeah, right. Survivor. Are you kidding me?
Like, I have to be independent. Absolutely not. Now, with the king's daughters, they did, once they got to new friends, have some power of choice. So when they arrived, for the first couple weeks, they would be placed in temporary lodging until they found a husband. But that did not take very long
Mm.
because in the colonies, there was 6 times more men ready to be married than there were women.
Of
S-
course.
So the king's daughters really had the chance to pick the man and life they wanted. So, as a result of the program, the king's daughters helped double the population of the colony between 1666 and 1672. So, with this massive population boom, the women had a lot of mouths to feed and they ran into the issue of ingredient availability. So, the dessert called sugar pie was and still is a common dessert in northern France and I think some parts of Belgium. And when the women brought the recipes with them to Canada, they had to make a few changes. So, for example, lard or pork fat was much more widely available than butter because pigs were easier to raise. So that meant that was used in the pie crust. On top of it, brown sugar in the colonies was completely inaccessible. So the women would trade with the First Nations in order to get either maple sugar or maple syrup. They also had dried fruit on hand because it kept really well. So sometimes they would chuck that in. So you see here, though, that as we get closer and closer to the history of the sugar pie, it starts to blend into the one of the butter tart. So a fun fact, I was searching, butter tarts from different grocery stores, and I
Hmm.
came across a butter tart filling.
Hmm.
And it was the same thing as, a lemon curd filling for a pie. And it said in English that it was a butter tart filling, and then in French that it was a sugar pie filling. So, except for the size of each, I'm not sure there's a difference to begin with,
Hmm.
but it's difficult to make the distinction between both languages. Now, we've also lost a large chunk of pie history here in Canada, but I would agree with most experts that although they're both very similar, sugar pie is a full size pie that originated in French Canada, whereas butter tarts are very small and dainty creations from English Canada. So if we look back, there is a chance that Ontario created this dish on its own, with the influence of settlers from southern Scotland who came to Canada in the 1800s and brought with them ecliffican tarts, also known as border tarts. So, border tarts are a form of sugar paste based pie filled with dried fruit and made in a pie tin. So, they're not that far off and could have been a nice base for further evolution. However, border tarts, have spices in them, like cinnamon, and
Hmm.
sometimes icing on top. And I mean, Canadians would clearly take up the opportunity to add more sugar on something. What do you think?
I think you're right. Yeah, I feel like Canadians definitely would have any opportunity to add sugar on top of anything, considering the
Yeah,
fact that maple syrup itself is already sweet enough. Maple syrup on anything, God, it's delicious. So I could see why.
I feel like even if we had taken out the icing, we would have replaced it with something, for example, like whipped cream. I don't
Yeah.
believe in a world where we would have taken inspiration from a recipe that had warm spices and
Hmm.
not include those spices. That makes a little bit of sense. We're not good with spices. But I would have seen like the icing being substituted or adapted to the resources we had available. I don't really believe we would have taken something out of the original. That doesn't make sense to me. But
Not at
now
all.
there's a culinary historian named Liz Driver who wrote about the English side of the butter tart, and she seems to be frustrated with all those comparisons. Any comparison. She thinks that in English Canada, homemakers at the times who had dairy, eggs, flour, lard, and brown sugar just put it together to feed their families, farmhands, and visitors. And it was sort of a spur of the moment, out of necessity invention that came to be completely on its own. She says, and I quote, "Why is it that Canadians can't just accept that we made something ourselves?"
Hmm.
Then she also says, "It's absolutely, completely believable that something did sort of rise up out of the grassroots." I hate that quote so much. I do not like it. It irks me. I wanted to write it out, but then
Yeah.
I thought it was best to address it and provide some nuance. So
Hmm.
let me start off by saying that if butter tart is completely Scottish or English and has nothing to do with sugar pies, that is fine by me. I actually would like to say that Scotland has some influence on Canadian cookery. That would be really cool. But I dislike the overtone of that quote because it makes it sound as if Canadian cuisine is based on a single group's perspective and creativity and sort of dismisses any outside influence. Like, were those homemakers indigenous? Were they English? Did they grow out of a tree? It doesn't make sense. And
Right.
if we say that butter tarts came to be completely organically on their own, and that this makes them the most Canadian dessert there is, as she argues, it somehow implies that every other Canadian dessert out there has to be born out of thin air in order to be deemed Canadian enough.
Right.
In that sense, we're stripping credit away from real immigrants who came to this country and brought this knowledge with them, before repurposing it and giving it to us.
Hmm.
I think the objective truth has to be that someone from another country came to Canada and remixed a dish they grew up with. And to me, a dish can't be truly Canadian unless part of it came from another country. So yeah, that was my run for the episode. What's your take on it?
I I have to agree with you. Having lived in America and here now, I've noticed that North America, just in general, is a melting pot of cultures, traditions, of a lot of people, very different people of all over the world, and it actually does kind of sound a little. I don't want to say ignorant, but it does sound weird hearing that quote and
Yeah.
thinking like, oh, we're. I mean, how do you define Canadian? How do you define a Canadian?
Well, that's
There's
it.
so much culture here and everything, and it's hard to say like, oh, just Canadians in general created or came up with this. But I agree with you in that sense that um, there definitely is a lot of cultural influence in Canadian food, and you can
Yeah.
see it. It's obvious. It's clear. Uh, but yeah, I completely agree with you.
To me, any Canadian dish worth having has some inspiration in another culture. And I mean, Canada, as it stands, is 150 years old. We have not been here for a long time. Indigenous communities have been here for a long time. So it's either immigrants who came and actually brought something and brought their knowledge, or indigenous communities who had an influence on us, or both.
Right.
It sounds here as though the author is trying to create this box of the perfect Canadian that would have I guess created something out of thin air, and it just
Hmm.
historically and logically does not make sense based on the immigration patterns of the country and how it was
Hmm.
made. Now, this quote did get me riled up.
Clearly.
You know, it's like it haunted me for a while. I think I texted it to you and I texted it to everybody I knew. And then I called my
Yeah.
mom and she was like, "Are
Yeah.
you really calling me about this?" I was like, "This is important." She was like, "It's not really." And it's just, I cannot stand the oversimplification of a multicultural cuisine.
Hmm.
So I feel good to get it all out of mic. I feel very light now, very skinny. So if the author wants to talk to me and clarify if she thinks I misinterpreted her perspective, I'd be more than open to talking about it. This
Hmm.
quote does come from an article. I'm going to link it up in the sources, but her book was like 300 bucks. I think it's just because it's now resold and I'm not able to get it through public libraries or anything like that. So until I can get the full book, I understand I might not have completely
Understood
understood the
it, but yeah.
context. Yeah.
Hmm.
So I'm happy to be wrong. I'm wrong pretty much every day. And I'd love to see what data she got throughout her research phase that brought her to that conclusion. Now, on to the more wholesome stuff.
Finally.
Today, we did bake our own butter tarts based on a recipe that will be available on the Canadian Food blog shortly. So, how was that experience for you?
Oh boy, do I have a story for you.
Okay.
So I went out and bought my ingredients about a
Uh-huh.
week in advance, right? You remember, I told you I'm going to head out, I'm going to buy everything. Great,
Yeah.
cool. I got everything. I came here and I was all set and ready for today. I woke up this morning and I'm like, all right, let me get everything out and let's see if I can, you know, kind of mentally prepare myself to do this. I opened my freezer and I don't know what went through my mind, but I did not buy butter tart shells.
What? What?
I somehow bought these like the pastry
Philo?
yes, whatever it is, those like round things that are like I because
Oh
it was also Tender Flake brand,
no. Yes.
but it was right next to it and I remember looking at it in the freezer, right? And I'm looking at it and I'm like, "Oh, they have some other thing. What is that? Some pastry thing?" And it was right next to it. And as I'm looking at it, I swear to you, I got the butter tart shells. I feel like I probably died at some point in the week and I am now living in a separate universe because there's no way, there's no way that I actually bought that. Whatever.
I think an evil spirit actually came into your house and swapped them. But now, do you have those Philo cups like standing in the
They're in
freezer?
the freezer. Yeah.
So Because like those, what I would do is I would take a wheel brie and some
Mhm.
jam and some
Mhm.
nuts and just put that in the oven. Because immediately I was like, it sucks that this happened to you, but also now I want to
It's a
cook
blessing
with
in
them.
disguise. Yeah,
Yeah,
I know, that's what I'm saying. I'm like, because I would have never bought that in my life, and now
yeah.
I have them in my freezer, and I'm like, well, I have to do something with them. But okay, let me get into like the real like nitty-gritty of this stuff, right?
Uh-huh.
So Lisa went out, got me the butter tart shells. Great. So I have the shells. Mind you, I was also working today from 9 to 5. So, and yeah, I work from home. That's great. But while I was working, I was like, okay, well, I have to do these butter tarts at some point.
Yeah.
As I was making the butter tarts, I also had to come back into the office and take care of work. And then I was running in and out of my
Wait, did
office.
you wiggle the mouse every 4 minutes?
Yes. It was such a mess. Like it was a mess for me personally. My the table where I was prepping everything was a huge mess.
That
Complete
is
mess.
so
I
funny.
started sweating because I was running back and forth. I was running back and forth and it was crazy. But again, doing the recipe was simple. It was the fact that I was also working at the same time. But overall, it came
Yeah,
out really good, really great. I was
that's
so
fair.
excited when I was making it. It smelled fantastic in this apartment. Oh my God. That smelled
Oh yeah,
so
it
good.
smells so good because it's just brown butter, maple syrup, and sugar.
Hmm.
It is a delightful recipe. So I do think it's pretty simple. I tried to divide it so that one batch gave you three flavors and you did have some variety. And I
Hmm.
did make the executive decision to substitute the corn syrup because the original recipe had so much of it. I
Hmm.
switched it out for more brown sugar and maple syrup. So
Hmm.
now we have a couple of them and we currently have the classic one. Would you like to try it?
I would definitely like to try it.
Okay.
I'm so excited for this.
Salty.
Cheers. It's really good. I like it. The nutty flavor, really good. The crunch, really good. Great texture, great flavor. Sweetness isn't even that bad in my opinion, you know. Like it's not like overly sweet. Compensates really well. I like it.
Yeah, I like that one. I think the crust is very buttery,
Hmm.
and then the filling is not as sweet as you think. I think I say that very often on the podcast. Maybe I'm going to be like labeled off as a sugar bug.
Hmm.
I don't think it's that sweet. I think the butter really compensates for it. And then I know there's even some variations where, in order to lift everything up, they'll add a touch of lemon. Now, I haven't tried it because I don't think at the time they would have had lemon. So
Hmm.
it didn't really make sense to add it because it would have been like I guess an improvement that is not completely traditional. But I do think it would be smart if you wanted to do a professional butter tart that you sold in a bakery. Now, if you had to pair this butter tart with any drink, what would it be?
Milk, milk.
Okay, yeah.
In my opinion, um, I'm an almond milk. You know, God, I'm a hoe for almond milk, but
Uh-huh.
milk in general, it's really good.
Yeah, I think it would be good to add this with something like refreshing and creamy. I think I would have it with a latte maybe. Just to have like coffee
Coffee taste.
waking me up after all this
Hmm.
fat and sugar, but then
Hmm.
something still creamy. So I'm a hoe for oat milk. It
Great
would
take.
most likely be an oat milk latte,
Yeah.
and it would be like really creamy, really rich with the espresso cutting through. It would be really nice.
Hmm.
Now, this is for the classic one. If you wanted to make it at home, the process is actually really simple.
Yes. So the biggest trick is buying the crust ahead. You can get the tart shells from Tenderflake, which contain lard, making them traditional but not vegetarian or halal. And just work on creating the filling.
Yeah, so on my end, I had to actually switch it out because I made the first batch and then I was about to eat one and I was like, "Oh, it's funny. I just did research and found out that traditionally it uses lard." And then I read the back and I was like, "Oh, it still does. Oh,
Hmm.
that's fun. It's traditional." And I just put it down and I was devastated. So, if you want a crust that fits your personal diet, you can just look very carefully for the store brand crust at your local grocery store, like Metro or Loblaws. They
Hmm.
often use vegetable shortening. Now, please don't listen to me on a whim. buy any store brand pie crust and then blame me. Do make sure to read the ingredients, but usually the second one will be vegetable shortening if it's the basic brand like No Name.
Right. And that's always an easy swap. Then this can be broken down into 4 steps. One, prepare your toppings and pre bake the shells. You can soak your raisins in water or rum. A quick anecdote, I actually wish I soaked them in rum. That
Yeah,
sounds fantastic.
I wanted to do it, but it felt like it would have taken away from the
From the
OG.
original,
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
but yes.
You can soak your raisins in water or rum, and you can take the time to toast the pecans if you want. Second, you'll whisk together the brown sugar and melted butter until fully dissolved. For that step, you need to make sure that the butter is truly melted or the sugar won't dissolve.
Mhm.
Third, you whisk in the maple syrup, egg, vanilla extract, and salt before pouring the mixture into the pre baked shells. That was really fun, by the way, doing that. I had so much fun doing that. The last step is baking it at 425 degrees for 10 minutes and then 375 degrees for another 10. That temperature shift is just a good way to make sure you get a gooey tart with a crisp topping. And then you're done. And you can eat them all in one go. Do not recommend it because, boy, that's like well over 1,000 calories.
There's
But
so many.
really good. Extremely good.
There
Tempting. Very tempting.
I mean, I it's one of the first times in a podcast I would say that if I wanted to, I definitely could without without an
Yes.
issue.
Hmm.
So overall, I think this is easily the most accessible recipe someone can do. And recently, I've been reading more about the importance of accessibility in cooking
Hmm.
and the idea that accessibility was always an issue that needs to be addressed, and how processed foods are the way to bridge the gap. So, I'll be talking more about it in next week's episode, but I like that this week's recipe is accessible for all, even if you don't have time to make the crust. So, there's nothing that can really go wrong, there's not too many steps. And this, except for the crust, people most likely have all of those ingredients at home and Philo. And if you want this to be completely vegan, you can just use vegan butter and cornstarch instead of the egg. Even then, it's nothing too crazy.
Hmm.
Because if you take the cornstarch and you bring it up to 425, then 375, or around those numbers, it will thicken. It will do what it needs to do.
Hmm.
But here, the simplicity of the butter tart does have a drawback. It means that people really care about staying true to form. So, have you heard of the raisin debate?
Yes, you went into full detail
Uh huh.
about this a while back.
Uh huh.
And yeah, I did read up on it a little bit and noticed that some people hate raisins. They hate the raisins in them and they don't think that it's a good idea to have them in there. Don't get it. Don't understand
They
why.
really hate them like their life depends on it. There seems to be like an actually really large chunk of people who are anti raisins and butter tarts. So, I have a few quotes, half from real articles, half from comedic ones. Actually, in this case, I think they're all comedic articles, so
Yeah.
do take them from a grain of salt. So the first one is Rosie Vasco, the first person to publish a butter tart recipe containing raisins, wrote a public apology, I think at the age of 98 years old, where she said the following: "My sincere apologies to anyone who has ever innocently bitten into a butter tart, unaware that it is filled with raisins. I have spent my life haunted by guilt for the undue anguish my recipe has caused the bake sale community." It's ridiculous. And then another woman pointed to the recipe published in Chatelaine, that's the original one from Rosie Vasco, and said, "This is it. It's hard for me to look at. Dad says it's what sent Granny to her grave." Then another quote is, my pastor, my pastor told me raisins are the husks of grapes who have gone to hell.
That sounds about right.
No, I mean, I love this. This article made me laugh so much. I linked the full thing in the references. But I do have a few theories in mind as to why there's such hate for the
Hmm.
husk of grapes who have gone to hell.
Hmm.
Would you like to explore them with me?